Hello, audience, wherever you may hail. I'm your host, John Bruni. Welcome to The Focus. Join us as we explore some of the world's most fascinating and essential contemporary developments, shedding a spot of light in a world filled with alternative fact darkness. In this episode, we are joined from the US by journalist and author Mike Rothschild. Mike is one of America's foremost experts on QAnon and will be speaking on some of the themes covered in his latest book, The Storm is Upon Us: How QAnon Became a Movement, Cult, and Conspiracy Theory of Everything. Mike, welcome to The Focus.
Thank you for having me.
Mike, let's start at the beginning. What does the term QAnon actually mean? Is it an acronym for something?
This is actually a more complicated question than you might think. So the actual, as all of these things are. So
Right.
the term QAnon has two component parts. One is the Q and the other is the Anon. So Q was the code name for what claimed it was a military intelligence team working hand in hand with President Trump to enact an upcoming purge of the deep state that was being leaked to patriots through a series of cryptic clues on the image board 4chan and then later 8chan. This team called themselves Q, claiming that they had Q clearance. So right there's a number of problems. Q clearance is an actual designation, but it's a Department of Energy term that has to do with simply having some access to technology related to nuclear power. I know people who have Q clearance. It's not that big of a deal. The idea of the kind of secretive, ultra sensitive Q clearance, that comes from a couple of different possible sources, all of which are different rabbit holes to go down that we won't go down here. The Anon part of it simply means anonymous. And there is a long tradition on these boards of people coming in and pretending that they are these important anonymous figures who are leaking details about something. So you had FBI Anon, you had White House Insider Anon, there was an MI5 Anon leaking the secrets of British intelligence. All this stuff is made up. It doesn't mean anything. But the actual term QAnon is kind of the fusing of those two things. And it's also important to note that people who were under the QAnon umbrella, people who were believers in that movement, began to discard the term, and they would later claim that they never used it, that it was made up by the mainstream liberal media to make them all look crazy. Now, never mind that they were using the term freely for many years. And in fact, the most popular pro-Q book is actually called QAnon, An Invitation to the Great Awakening. So any thought that these people never used this term is just ridiculous.
Mike, if you don't mind me saying so, your surname seems to be one that is rather synonymous with various conspiracy theories as well. So would I be correct in saying you're almost the perfect person to write the antidote, if I can put it to you this way, to QAnon, right?
A little too perfect, maybe. I am not related to the Rothschild banking family. My family comes from a completely different part of Germany. And what's interesting is I'm actually working on another book right now about the history of the Rothschild banking family
Oh,
mythos.
good. Yeah.
And one of the things that I learned very early on in the process was that the people who are actually part of that family, and there are many, many members of the Rothschild family right now, they don't talk about this stuff. They don't do interviews about it. They don't talk about it publicly. I spoke to the head of the family archive in London, and she said that they don't do interviews about this because they don't want to have to prove a negative. You can't prove that your family doesn't run every central bank in the world. The person making the accusation has to prove it. Of course, that's not the way these people work. So what they do then is they just don't talk about it. They leave that to other people. So if I were actually related to the Rothschilds, I'd be the last person going public to debunk any of this stuff.
And you're only saying that because you're part of the Bilderberger group, right?
Right, sure. And the Council on Foreign Relations and the Trilateral Commission and the New World Order. I've got my buttons on my jacket. It's I mean, this stuff has always been in our culture. And Q works really well because it picks up on things that have been around for a long time. So this idea of the super government, the shadow government, the insiders, that's all basic conspiracy theory stuff. Q just adds a social media sheen to it and repackages it as something participatory and new that you get to be part of. But the component parts, as I write about quite a bit in the book, are very, very old, very shop worn, and they're reused over and over because they work.
So, Mike, what came first, the chicken or the egg? Was QAnon a symptom of modern social media, where the whole notion of objective truth is constantly under question? Or was it because the American electorate was just so jaded by contemporary power politics as it was playing out in Washington, D.C.?
Well, the unfortunate answer is yes, it's all of those things.
Right.
Q never would have been able to take off with the speed that it did without social media. And I think more accurately, without the complicity of the social media companies who allowed this to spread almost completely unchecked for years before finally doing anything about it. But it really also spoke to a moment in our culture where we had a conspiracy theorist president. We had Donald Trump, who rose to political power not because of his experience or his ideas, but because he was going on The View and talking about how Barack Obama's birth certificate was fake. And, there was a plane crash that killed the only Hawaiian health official who had the power to release it. I mean, he found something in right-wing American conspiracy culture that was very, very exploitable, and he exploited it. And so QAnon was an easy outgrowth of that because it really tapped into a lot of the stuff he'd been talking about. But it also set up Hillary Clinton as the figure who would finally be brought down. The Clinton conspiracy complex had been running for decades in the US, going back to the early 90s. But finally, here was somebody who was going to take her down, who was going to make sure she got what she deserved. So Q really was the right conspiracy theory hitting at the right time in the right way.
So there is no real coherent philosophy behind QAnon, right?
There's no coherent storyline. The actual particulars of what were supposed to happen were constantly changing. But the philosophy behind it is actually rather consistent. There is a cabal of unimaginably corrupt and evil insiders who have been lying to you about everything and oppressing you and keeping you down, and we're going to fix it. We're going to change it. We're going to get rid of these people, and Trump is going to be the one who we've been waiting for this whole time, and he's finally going to do it. That's really the consistent mythology of Q. The particulars of how this is all going to happen, when it's going to happen, that changes constantly. And that is a kind of a hallmark of these kinds of prophetic movements. The thing that's supposed to happen is always the same. The way it's supposed to happen and when it's supposed to happen, that's constantly in motion. And only the guru at the very top knows for sure what it's going to look like when it happens.
You mean the guy that's sitting at the 33rd degree somewhere in a great hall in a large city?
Right.
The Grand Poobah.
Right, the Grand Poobah, but for the white hats. So
Right.
The black hats have been the Masons, the Illuminati, the Trilateral Commission, the Rothschilds, Soros. The white hats are the patriots who are running this secret program. And Q is very much in line with many other gurus who claim to have this kind of secret knowledge. And I write about this a lot in the book. With a lot of these things, it's a financial scam. It's, I know when the Iraqi dinars are going to reach their maximum value. It's, I know when the great financial instrument is going to be released. With Q, it was, I know when Hillary Clinton and George Soros and Barack Obama are going to be arrested. So follow me if you want that to happen. And for so many people, that was just an irresistible message.
So could I say that the burden of proof now has become so difficult that the system has simply given up trying to explain why they do the things they do, knowing full well there are a number of people out there, a percentage of the population, that simply won't listen because they've hooked up with QAnon?
Yeah, I think the idea that we can debunk or fact check or debate our way out of these kinds of movements just misunderstands the way they work and misunderstands why people get into them. People get into these kinds of movements to have their grievances listened to. It's the feeling that somebody has been keeping me down. I have not gotten what I wanted out of life. somebody is responsible for it, and they need to pay for it. That's such an emotional reaction that you can't meet that with facts. There's a very popular QAnon video, one of many, and the first, I think it's Out of the Shadows. I can't remember which one. There's so many, but it starts off with this sort of gravelly voiced narrator, and one of the first lines in it is, "Do you ever wonder why you can't get ahead in life?" And everybody listening to that is going to go, "Uh-huh. Of course I wonder why I can't get ahead in life. I mean, what kind of question is that?" And so things like QAnon exploit that kind of grievance, that kind of feeling like I didn't get the life I was promised, and someone is responsible for it.
Yeah, yeah. So, to what degree do American talk show hosts like Tucker Carlson or Alex Jones play in stoking these fires? Oh, and by the way, what about Joe Rogan, who's sort of always delicately balancing himself between the whack jobs on the one side and serious people on the other? He seems to have a niche all by himself, but I think that he also feeds into the whole QAnon or conspiracy theory setting. Yeah.
Yeah, and with Rogan, it's almost like you never know who you're going to get, depending on who the guest is. I've heard Rogan episodes that I think are fantastic. He did an interview with the director of the documentary Q Into the Storm, which I did a little bit on. I was interviewed for it. It didn't make the cut, but that was a terrific episode. And then he does things that are just mind-bogglingly bizarre. With people like Tucker Carlson, Alex Jones, it's not so much the endorsement of Q. I think Tucker Carlson has talked a little bit about it, always in the guise of like, well, what's wrong with asking questions? What's wrong with wanting to know the truth? And Alex Jones was very pro Q, and then he was very much against Q. I mean, and possibly because Q was getting more popular than he was. But what it is it's weaponizing that grievance of, they don't want you talking about this. They don't want you answering these questions. These people think they're better than you, and they don't want to be examined. So what are they trying to hide? Why don't they want us talking about it? So it's never about endorsing the bizarre belief. Especially for a really mainstream host, it's about kind of endorsing the just asking questions, just trying to get the truth philosophy. Well, they are really powerful and they are really rich, so what are they trying to hide? It's a very delicate balance. And of course, you'd see the same balance going on with mainstream conservative politicians in the US. It was very much not endorsing QAnon because it was way too weird for them to endorse, but it was also never pushing back against it. It was never saying, this is disgusting, we don't want this, this is not our party. It was always, well, people have questions, people are just looking for the truth. So it's that kind of wishy-washy, I'm not saying it is, I'm not saying it isn't. And so that is left up just to the individual viewer to interpret.
All right. What role does slavish following of freedom of the press in the US have on all of this? There is this notion that, well, if you are of reasonable mind, you have the right in this country to say what you like, and you have the right to have an audience to listen to whatever you want to say. I mean, is this also something that, tends to also play into all of this? But without having that, with freedom comes great responsibility, that oft quoted Spider-Man.
Spider-Man, yeah.
Yeah.
So it's really tricky. And I think you get into some very troubling free speech issues when you're talking about shutting some of this stuff down. But I think it's really important to understand that what a lot of these people think of as free speech is not the kind of speech most people want. This idea that social media should be, everybody gets to say anything they want, and they can say back to me anything I want, and we'll settle it with a vigorous debate, that almost instantly and constantly turns into anti-Semitism, conspiracy theories, disinformation, organized harassment, organized trolling and threats. That is not free speech. Calling in bomb threats to hospitals is not free speech. Doxing people and having lunatics show up at your front door, that's not free speech. That's not what most people want. Most people want to go somewhere where they can say what's on their mind, but where there are some guardrails and there are some rules. You can't walk into a bar and start screaming at women and not think you're going to get thrown out. That's the way we treat public spaces. And I feel like we need to be treating private spaces the same way. Facebook and Twitter and YouTube, they have rules. And it's not as if these companies are saying you can't say this anywhere. When you get kicked off one of these sites, it's you can't say it here. We have rules, you broke them. And go somewhere else that doesn't have these rules. There's plenty of places like that. It's just that most people don't want to go there because there are no guardrails. There's no safety. And most people do not want to spend their online life being harassed and trolled and deluged with disinformation.
But wouldn't you say that those people who then find themselves at the, backside end of a social media channel because they've been kicked out from their extreme views, those people would come back and say, yes, but, if it was Facebook or Twitter, it's a conspiracy theory at the highest level because they do not want to know the truth. And I am telling you the truth about whatever the, situation happens to be.
Yeah. And that's a huge part of it. The idea that these companies are in on it. One of the big things you see in a lot of the Q drops is, allegations that Facebook is part of this conspiracy. Mark Zuckerberg is, purposefully throttling disinformation. I mean, the opposite was true. We know from reporting, I think it was by the Washington Post, that Zuckerberg specifically didn't deplatform Alex Jones because he didn't want to be seen as being censorious of conservatives. And this is kind of where we are. We're now in a place where social media is just a battleground for conspiracy theories, for disinformation, for panic over, transgender people, over vaccines. I mean, all of these things that most people didn't spend a lot of time thinking about are now kind of front and center in our faces all the time because there's no rules about what's being allowed on these sites. And if there are rules, they're not being enforced consistently.
Mike, a lot's been said on the 6th of January Capitol riots that most of the people who heeded Trump's rally, not rally, were QAnon supporters, including my favorite, Buffalo Man. So despite the crazy conflicting theories they stand for, QAnon has nonetheless left a very profound mark on US politics, right?
Absolutely. The iconography of QAnon was everywhere on January 6th. You saw it on the shirts and the signs. And there's an example that doesn't get reported on much where a bunch of insurrectionists were destroying camera equipment that belonged to the Associated Press and screaming, "We are the news now." That's a QAnon catchphrase. That nobody said that before QAnon invented that. So the iconography of it was there, but more than that, the philosophy of it was there. That Donald Trump needs us to be his digital soldiers. And if that means overthrowing the government, if that means killing the vice president, then we will do it because he needs us. And we're gonna be there for him. This idea of this kind of two-way back and forth between patriots and Trump is one of the building blocks of QAnon. They would talk constantly about the deltas. This idea that Q would post and then Trump would tweet, and it would be like seconds apart. And there's no way that this could be mathematically impossible. I talk about in the book how actually it can completely be a coincidence. Trump tweeted all the time. And if you posted something that was around the time when he usually tweeted, there's a pretty good chance they would go up at right around the same time. That's just math. The things that they would post about would have nothing to do with what Trump was tweeting. It's just noise. But these people were desperate to believe that Trump had picked them to be his vanguard. And you saw an enormous amount of that on January 6th, this idea of he needs us and we're here for him.
I'm John Bruni, and you're listening to Sage International's The Focus podcast, and we're speaking with QAnon expert Mike Rothschild. So, Mike, if QAnon isn't a social movement and it's not a political party, it's a cult without a leader?
It has a number of very cult-like tendencies. And one of the things I really wanted to get at with the book is when we use that term, are we using it correctly? Or are we applying the stereotypes that we've had of cults, where it's a bunch of people in beige frocks tilling the soil and waiting for orders from their leader. There's a lot of ways that QAnon is not like that. But there are a lot of ways that Q is like a cult. It has that in-group versus out-group dynamic. It has the jargon. It has the shared understanding and the shared agreements and the shared language. It doesn't have a charismatic leader, but it has a messianic figure in Trump, who is the charismatic leader of what many people would say is a very cult-like following. So it hits enough of the buttons of being a cult where I think you can talk about it as a cult, and I don't think you're wrong for doing it, because I think what we think of as a cult is not necessarily how most cults are. It's not people in a compound who are brainwashed and can't leave. People do walk away from Q. You just don't want to, because if you walk away from it, you're going to miss out on the great events that's about to happen. It's just a few days away, or it's next week. And if you leave now, well, then it was all for nothing. And so eventually you have a movement where you can go, you just don't have anywhere to go to.
The power of QAnon is the fact that they take a kernel of truth and blow it out completely. And while at the same time, they are willfully blind to the inconsistencies of the weird narratives. But in terms of that, is that their ultimate focal point? The idea that you can strip back all the fluff and dice, but ultimately there's always some little kernel of truth in there. And so therefore, it's got to be true. You make that kind of weird connection, right? Like, for instance, if we go through some of the more famous conspiracy theories, like something around Jeff Epstein and Pizzagate, and
Sure.
as you mentioned earlier, Hillary Clinton. Can you walk us through some of these sort of weird theories that do have a little bit of truth around them, which makes them very difficult to sort of, what's the word I'm looking for? Debunk.
Yeah. So it's much easier to debunk or dismiss a theory that is completely made up than it is to debunk or dismiss something that has a very small amount of truth to it, because then you fall back on that little piece of truth. So with something like Jeffrey Epstein, here was a guy who was not a good person and was connected in some very dark ways to a lot of very powerful people, including the Clintons. I mean, that's not made up. That's real. And then when you have his suicide, you have an event that is not supposed to happen. He's not supposed to be able to kill himself. That can't happen. There has to be another explanation. And we find so often with conspiracy theories, they're based on something that isn't supposed to happen. The John F. Kennedy assassination, the 9/11 attacks. You look at it and go, that's unreal. That doesn't happen. Planes don't just fly into towers. Something else had to happen there. And so what often happens is our lack of imagination for envisioning sort of worst case scenarios is transformed into conspiracy theories. And I think you can certainly say something like that with Epstein. You look at the factors that went into his suicide. The cameras weren't working. They must have been turned off. Well, it's a 30-year-old prison that probably hasn't been updated since it was built. There's no money for it. The cameras are broken all over prisons around America. The guards don't care. They're getting minimum wage. They of course they're going to fall asleep. It doesn't matter to them what happens. So you go and you find what actually happened, and each one of those little things can be explained. There's an explanation that's not as salacious, but it's much more rooted in reality. But when you keep throwing more and more things onto it, it gets harder and harder to explain all of them away. And so the conspiracy theory becomes the preferred explanation, rather than this is a very common thing that's not that big of a deal. There's some human failure here, there's some incompetence, but there's not a conspiracy, because we want the conspiracy. We want there to be a plot, because that's a better explanation.
And of course, people are usually oblivious to the fact that there are these black swan events that come out from left field. No one's been anticipating them. And then, of course, as you rightly point out, you've got, situations where systems don't work as efficiently and effectively as they otherwise would. And so we can be sideswiped quite quickly by something that weren't prepared to encounter. Yeah.
Right, and that's exactly it. And of course we saw that with the pandemic.
Mm.
People are saying, "Oh, this is unprecedented. There's no way this could have happened naturally." Well, actually, there is. I mean, we get hit by pandemics. Like every 100 years or so, we have a disease that just spreads through the culture. It just happens. And if you look at the technical failures, the political failures, the cultural failures, but then you have to start blaming people that you maybe don't want to blame. You maybe have to look at President Trump and say, he could have done more here and he didn't do it. You have to look at the Chinese government and say they weren't honest with what was going on. We don't want human failure, because then it's like, well, there was nothing we could do. You want there to have been something you could have done, and you couldn't. You were prevented from it because of the New World Order. It's easier to blame the New World Order than it is to blame incompetence or random chance.
Oh, yeah, definitely. So, how dependent is the Republican Party on QAnon supporters? Are they as powerful a group as we outside the United States believe they are?
I don't know that they are particularly dependent on QAnon itself at this point, because Trump is not in power and because the Q poster has mostly been silent over the last almost 2 years now. What they are completely dependent on is the conspiracy theory behind QAnon. That belief that the election was stolen, COVID was a hoax, cancel culture is the biggest threat facing us all. Those conspiracy theories are a huge part of QAnon, but they can exist without QAnon. And they're doing a very good job of existing without QAnon. So those things now all combine together to create a kind of, as I talk about, conspiracy theory of everything. And that theory of everything is really a foundational belief of the modern Republican Party. I don't think you can be a prominent Republican now and believe that vaccines are safe and effective. Joe Biden won the election. Cancel culture is not that big of a deal, and everything is generally fine. You can't prosper in today's American Republican Party if you think all those things, because nobody wants to hear that. They want to hear Biden lost and is only president through massive fraud. COVID was invented by the Wuhan Institute and spread around by Bill Gates. They want to believe that. It's not a question of being given the facts. They don't want the facts. They want their facts, and they're not going to give them up.
Is there any evidence at all that this QAnon phenomenon is part of some sort of Russian disinformation campaign? The only country that really benefited from the chaotic, incoherent Trump years was Vladimir Putin. Or is this just another conspiracy theory from non-American QAnon people?
There is really no evidence that QAnon had any particular link to Russian disinformation or Chinese disinformation or Iranian disinformation. There's just nothing there. There was a little bit of early boosting of certain QAnon hashtags that was done by accounts that were linked to the Internet Research Agency, but it was a very small percentage. It was something like 10 to 15% of QAnon tweets at the very beginning. And of course, all of the QAnon influencers are either American or Western, or English speaking. So all of these gurus who took QAnon's content and ran with it in their own direction, they're all English speaking. Most of them are easily identifiable. They're not Russian trolls. They're just American grifters. And Americans have a really unique ability to get sucked in by conspiracy theories, much more so than many other cultures. We love plots, we love schemes, we love thinking that there's somebody out to get us. We always have. The buttons that QAnon pushed are homegrown American Republican evangelical conspiracy theorist stuff that's been around for a long, long time. It didn't need any stoking from Vladimir Putin.
Okay, so have we ever been in this situation before historically, Mike? I mean, has there been a time when a country was so thoroughly divided based on pushing nonsensical narratives?
Well, America has had times when it's been divided. Certainly go to the Civil War and the immediate aftermath of that. But this false narrative, this idea that half the country thinks Joe Biden didn't actually win the election, We've never been there before. We've always been able to agree on certain basic, not moral issues, but factual issues. Who is the president? What is actually going on here? Is this disease real or engineered? I mean, we've always been able to agree on sort of basic facts, and we just differed in our interpretation of those facts. We are now not even agreeing on whether up is up and down is down. And I don't know how we carry forward as a country when we are so incredibly divided on the very basics of what reality is. You've got half of this country living in its own reality. And of course, that half thinks that the other half is living in its own reality. So it is a precipice that we are rapidly approaching, and that I don't know that we have any real way of getting off of.
I recall watching you have a YouTube interview with, let me see, is it Mike Shermer, the
Yes,
head of
Michael
the
Shermer.
Skeptics Group? Yeah.
Yes.
So anyway, in that, the question was posed to you, how does one combat the growing allure of QAnon? And you were talking about the fact that if you were with Uncle Bob at the kitchen table and Uncle Bob is pushing a particular QAnon line, you had the capacity to get up from the table and say, listen, Uncle Bob, love you dearly, but if you continue down this path, I'm getting out of here. Is that really the only way that we can start shutting some of this, conspiracy theory philosophy down, or is there another way?
Well, I think that's the most effective way. The idea of getting people out of these movements, de-radicalizing people, it's a very slow-moving study because it's so difficult. Everybody's journey into a conspiracy theory is a little bit different, and therefore everybody's journey out of a conspiracy theory has to be a little bit different. And I really think that if we're going to figure out a way out of this moment, we do need to be having those conversations with the people in our lives, with the people who are closest to us, not screaming at random strangers on Twitter. That doesn't do anything. But if you have that person in your life, you have the right to say, I love you dearly, but I don't want to do this. I don't want to talk about this. I don't want to talk about QAnon. I don't want to talk about how Trump really won. If you want to talk about that, that's fine. You go do that somewhere else. But we're going to have a civil conversation. We're going to talk about things that we enjoy together, but not about politics or conspiracy theories. And if you can't abide by that, then we can't have a conversation. And I think that idea of drawing boundaries, drawing lines of what we're willing to talk about, what we're willing to sort of put up with, especially on social media, that's going to be the way we get out of this. And if you want to stay in that person's life, that's great. But you have to do it in a way that is safe for you, that makes you feel like you are valued. It's not just, taking that person's abuse, taking those person's wild conspiracy theories. It's saying, I love you. I want you to be part of my life, but not with this. So when you're ready to talk about something else, I'm here. And if they do start to kind of see the cracks in the conspiracy movement, then you've offered yourself up as that safe person, as a person who they can talk to, they can maybe find some common ground with. Because a lot of other people are just going to say, goodbye, I don't want anything to do with you, and completely shut them off forever, which is okay too. But if you want that person in your life, you have to be that landing spot for them. And that's really, really hard, because your instinct is always going to be to just dismiss them, call them crazy, and block them, because that's what we do all day on social media. We got crazy people and we block them.
Yep.
So it's hard, and it has to be done at a very small scale, very personal level.
Is there any form of, I don't know, government-derived education that can be put out there at a social, political level that can actually knock some of this stuff on its head? Or is that just, mill for the grist for the conspiracy theorists out there?
Well, I think, unfortunately, anything that comes from the government is going to be regarded with suspicion. We have this weird moment in America right now where, for a long time, the conspiracy theory machine saw the office of the president as just another puppet of the Illuminati. They're all corrupt. They're all in the pocket of Jewish power. Republican, Democrat, doesn't matter. They hated George H.W. Bush as much as they hated Bill Clinton. That really all changed with Donald Trump. And they looked at him as this messianic figure. And now, of course, they've gone back to Biden, and the loathing is there more than ever. So anything that comes from that kind of government is immediately going to be regarded with suspicion. Where I think there is a role for government is enforcing some of the laws that we have, particularly laws about harassment, laws about threats, things like that, but also working with the social media companies to ensure that there is a healthier discourse on these major platforms: Facebook, Twitter, TikTok, YouTube. You're never going to see the government regulating a place like 8chan. That's 8chan exists because people want unregulated speech there. But most people don't want that. Most people want somewhere where they know they can talk to people safely. So I think there is a role for government there. But when the Biden administration started to roll out the disinformation combating board, it was a disaster, and I knew it was going to be, because people look at the government as a source of disinformation. It's like, well, if the government's telling me something's fake, I know it's real. That kind of distrust is very American in a lot of ways.
Mike, thanks for sharing your insights on The Focus with us.
Of course. Thank you for having me.
Journalist and author Mike Rothschild. If you would like to know more about this fascinating topic, I highly recommend you buy Mike's book, The Storm is Upon Us: How QAnon Became a Movement, Cult, and Conspiracy Theory of Everything. Available at all good bookstores or online purveyors of the written word. That's it for this episode. We hope that you enjoyed the show. My thanks to our guest Mike Rothschild and producers Neil Smart and Malcolm Hughes. Thanks also to the Ozcast Network. You can find The Focus on the Sage International website at sageinternational.com.au, hitting the Media Center drop-down menu and clicking podcasts. The Focus can also be heard on the Ozcast Network, iTunes, Spotify, Stitcher, TuneIn, Audible, and iHeartRadio. So if you like what you've heard, please like and review us on your favorite podcast platform. Every subscription we get or thumbs up you give helps the algorithm bump us up the digital ladder. And no, that's not a conspiracy theory. Until next time, I'm John Bruni, and you've been listening to Sage International's The Focus.